In this video, I'm going to tour Indiana. Instead of kind of using Google Earth and scrolling along and making you seasick, I'm just going to show static images of maps, of Google Maps, of these various landform features created from river processes. And so here is the Wabash River coming down and meeting with the Ohio River in the extreme southwestern corner of the state. And so here we have a perfect example of a meandering stream. The Wabash River is meandering as it's working its way to its eventual mouth where it dumps off into the Ohio River. That's a confluence there. What we have is we have these particular meanders, and so what it's doing is it's meandering in a particular floodplain, and hopefully you can see this floodplain represented by the flat area where we have a little bit more elevation over to the sides of this particular river. And what we have right here is the particular resistant area, persistent resistant rock has been able to resist over time the river, essentially removing it and washing it away. And so one of the things to think about is here, because we have a meandering stream, because it's just kind of going back and forth, we know that this is a flat area. We know this is the area in which we do not have a steep gradient. And so what that also showcases in this particular area is the sediment that's being laid down is alluvium. We associate alluvium with these fluvial processes in which the stream slows down and starts to lay down its material. So when rivers lay down the material, we call that alluvium. And the same is true for the Wabash River, where its confluence meets with the White River. And so here we can see the White River's floodplain as its rivers changed its course over time. And so we can see the floodplain quite easily. If you can imagine, it's kind of this upland area being the tops or the terrace looking down at the floodplain below. This is the confluence or the fork of the two different forks, the west fork of the White River and the east fork. This is where they meet. And here, what I'm trying to showcase is, once again, I'm trying to emphasize the idea of a floodplain. And so over time, going back to that previous video I've showed of the meandering stream, that animation, just imagine that particular fork of the White River kind of coming back and forth over time, creating and carving out this floodplain, which is shown as this yellow lines from one side to the other. It's important to note slope as well as the underlying bedrock or the underlying sediment. And so, of course, we have more resistance underlying bedrock and sediments here. And so one of the reasons why this is more of a straight path instead of a meander is, first off, resistance, this particular rock type. Also, keep in mind, this is the Dearborn Upland going down the Muscatatuck Plateau, which is really just a downward slope. It's a plateau, but it's a sloping area, region that slopes towards the southwest, towards the Scottsburg lowland. And so it's a relatively steep slope and continuous slope. And so for that reason, we have the Ohio River kind of moving through here at a rather quick pace, but also not meandering as much. Here's the Wabash River just to the east of Perrysville, Indiana. And I like to showcase this because it does a good job of showcasing two different features, the cut bank or the outer bank cut bank and the point bar deposit. So what we have is the outer bank, typically steeper, in which we have this outer bank in which we don't have any deposit or collection because the water is moving faster, and so there's no deposition occurring because essentially the water is moving it away. Whereas where the water is moving slow, it starts to deposit, leaves behind its sediment on the inside of a meander. And so the inside of a meander, we should see a point bar deposit. This is kind of these areas in which are transition. Sediment being laid down, moved, laid down, moved, laid down, and moved. And so these typically aren't good building sites, whereas the cut bank, it's pretty much going to be there always. And so we're not going to have deposition settling on one side, and we're not going to have buildup. It's going to be essentially right here, a very steep slope on the outside of this particular meander. I mention this because where do we see a lot of the early cities in Indiana, the influential ones that were formed or developed along a waterway? We see them on the outside of a meander. We see them on that cut bank. And here's Louisville. So here's the Ohio River coming through here. The outside of the meander is where the downtown or the origins of Louisville lie. And if I zoom out, there's Louisville on the outside of the meander. Look at New Albany. It's also on the outside of the meander. And so we see this particular pattern. So New Albany is a very, very prominent city early on. Jeffersonville, not so much. New Albany, for sure. Early on in early Indiana history, very important. So you're going to see this particular pattern, and it's a lot of this relates to flood. You're going to see more flooding on the inside of a meander than the outside, and so a lot of that's just simply for protection. Continuing on, Owensboro, Kentucky, so the other side of the Ohio River. And what you notice here is there is no Indiana side. This is a very flood-prone area, and so there's not really a good building site here because this is constantly being overlaid with water as the Ohio River floods, and this is sediment in transition, being laid down, being moved, being laid down, being moved, and so forth. Whereas all the development in Owensboro, Kentucky is on the outside of this meander. Also, if you take a look at the Kentucky-Indiana border. When we look at the Indiana-Kentucky border, Kentucky owns all of the Ohio River. So some states, it's right in the middle, like it is with Indiana and Illinois, right in the middle of the river. Where in the case of Kentucky, they have all of the river. And this is problematic when we look at, in this case, the inside of the meander of the Ohio River. This point bar deposit is built up so much that now it's land. And it's been that way for a good amount of time. And so here you can see the Indiana-Kentucky border. Wait a minute, it should be the Ohio River. Well, the Ohio River, essentially this point bar deposit is developed over time, and what they've done in Kentucky, of course, they build a horse track so they can do some gambling. So it's very Kentucky of them to do that on their very little part of Indiana that they got from this point bar deposit. Continuing on up the Ohio River, look at Evansville. Where was Evansville formed? On the outside of the meander. Vincennes, on the outside of the meander, not on the point bar. Terre Haute, the outside of the meander. Lafayette, the outside of the meander. You can see how West Lafayette, how they have to kind of build a little bit farther away from the river because of the flooding, and they left behind some of this vegetation, some of this land to help with flood control. Now I return back to southwest Indiana, where we have the confluence of the Wabash and the Ohio rivers. And so one of the things about rivers is they're problematic when they're used as borders because rivers change. They sometimes move their course, especially in these low-lying areas here in the Wabash lowland, and where we have the stream and river just constantly meandering all over. And so here we see the borders of Kentucky and Illinois. And so this over here is Illinois, this over here is Kentucky, and then this is Indiana. And so this river is going to move over time, and it's going to create kind of complex situations like we have here, in which this is the Wabash River. So the Wabash River, back when Indiana became a state, was right through here. However, the Wabash River, we have a cutoff of the meander, and so we have an Oxbow Lake forming now. And so this particular part of Indiana is essentially part of the Illinois, would say landmass, although it's an improper term. This is part of the Illinois area, part of the Illinois land, but it's part of Indiana because when Indiana was a state, this was the Wabash River meander. And so rivers are very complicated when they're used as boundaries. And so I mentioned an Oxbow Lake. Well, let's start talking about these type of features. Here we have this particular river, and this is in Jackson County. And what we see here is I like using this. Hopefully you can see this. This is the underlying hillshade uses LiDAR technology. LiDAR is essentially this way to look through the trees and look at look through the grass, look actually at the surface, the shape of the surface. And so what you can see is all these here are examples of meander scars. So as the river is meandered, it's left behind scars. And so these little slightly elevated features, these rugged topography in a really flat area, are examples of meander scars, which is one of those key terms I mentioned beforehand. Here we have the confluence of the driftwood and the flat rock rivers here in Columbus, and so this is where the east fork of the White River begins, and we can see a meandering, we see a floodplain. So it's this river here is floodplain, very clearly seen there. We have examples of Oxbow Lakes galore. So these are meanders previously in which we see the cutoff. So these are Oxbow Lakes, and so you can also see some meander scars as well. So this particular image is full of those particular features, Oxbow Lakes and meander scars. I like this one. This is the East Fork White River where it comes through the upland area of south central Indiana. And so here we see a meander that's been cut off. And so this is a good example of a meander scar. You can really clearly see this here. This very steep slope here was created back when the White River came through here, meandered up through here before. This is obviously this little area is once again an example of resistant rock. It's been able to resist it and push it this way instead of having it go through. I end with this. See if you can identify in this particular area near Medora, Indiana, where the floodplain is, where an undercut bank or banks might be, where point bar deposits are located, where a meander scar might be shown, and where you see an Oxbow Lake.